So in this session, we're actually diverting a bit from what we have learned so far by looking more closely into B2B or business-to-business marketing. Some of the things that we learned so far might apply mostly to B2C, business to consumer. Hence, it's important to understand how B2B is different than marketing to the final or the end consumer. So when we say B2B marketing, what we mean is those organizations that buy the products and services in order to make more products and services. So those will be organizations that are not the final consumer, but then they will sell to either another organization or to the final consumer. So what is the nature of B2B? What is it? So B2B, most likely, is much larger than the consumer market. And when we say larger, it means by volume, but also by the amount of money and transactions that go through it. And of course, mainly it's because many businesses will sell to other businesses, which will then sell to other businesses, and only at the end, it will actually reach the end consumer. So how does B2B market demand actually create? How is it created? So obviously, it has to be linked very strongly to consumer demand. So let's think about airplanes manufacturers. So airplane manufacturers will sell their planes to an airline. Then that airline will fly the end consumer. Now, obviously, the more consumers want to travel, the more there is a demand for aircrafts. The more there's a demand for aircrafts, the more this business will develop aircrafts. So this is just an example of how the end consumer demand obviously will affect the business demand as well. So the demand for business product usually will be relatively price inelastic. Now, what does that mean? Price inelastic, and we are going to talk more about it when we talk about price for the P in the 4 Ps, means that there is one price and there's not a lot of shopping around. So for example, Boeing is one of the major aircraft manufacturers, and they set a price of how much their aircraft would cost. And the airline don't have a lot of opportunities to shop around. So usually, B2B, there's not a lot of suppliers that can provide the business the type of services or products that they need in order to serve the end consumer, which creates the price inelasticity. Now, the demand in the business market tends to what we call fluctuate more than it does in consumer markets. And that, again, can be because there are very few players compared to consumers. There are many consumers out there, but there are not many businesses that offer what they can offer. So a lot of times, the demand for their services can be very high or very low. It is affected by the consumer market. But at the end, it will be consequence, the outcome will be in the business to business. So it's another factor that we want to understand is also that businesses are usually much more informed than the end consumer. So if you remember, we talked about consumer doing information search. However, a lot of consumers don't do really a full information search. And some of them do rely on heuristics, or they rely on their friends, or maybe on online sources. Businesses usually don't take that chance because they're doing transactions that have a lot of money involved. And hence, they're usually very much informed about what is going on, the prices, the supply, and so forth, which makes them more rational decision makers than emotional decision makers. Now, obviously, the B2B is different from the consumer market in a number of ways. So as we mentioned, there's not as many of them. So there's fewer business customers as compared to the end consumer. Also, the buying power is usually concentrated in only a few consumers. So in only a few firms and organizations actually rule the whole market. Unlike consumers, which even if they are affluent consumers, there's still many of them, and usually they're not the one that have most of the buying power. They're also different in the sense that they're a lot of times geographically concentrated. Part of it can be that many business to business have to use resources that comes from the land. So they will be concentrated, let's say, where there's oil, or where there's water, or where the weather fits whatever manufacturing they have to do. And also, they may be what we call vertical, or they can be horizontal. Vertical means that there are many businesses between the end consumer and the original manufacturer, but horizontal can also be that there's many businesses that serve one end consumer toward the end. So this is just a nice diagram that shows that business to business still needs to do marketing and sales and transaction just like a regular organization, but their end consumer is another business, another organization, and not an individual person. So how is the buying process happens in businesses, and how is it different than consumers? So when you buy or purchase from a business, it's usually a high involvement purchase, as it affects how well the business will later on serves its end customers. So a lot of times what businesses do, instead of doing the service themselves, they will outsource whatever needs to be outsourced. So for example, when Zappos just start their delivery, they actually, in the beginning, used external outsourcing in order to ship and deliver their products. However, by doing so, they lost control over the quality of the shipping and how the product actually reached the end consumer, which then later on made them use their own shipping arrangement, which is also what Amazon did. Amazon decided not to use an external business partner in order to do shipping. However, UPS and FedEx, their main business source is not individual people, but actually big companies that use them in order to deliver their products. Now, firms usually are under time pressure. Why? Because if they're stuck with inventory, they need to make sure that those products are going out, because the more they stay in their storage, the more money that it costs them. So a lot of time they will either create the product based on order, like when you create an aircraft, or they will try to push their products in order for another organization to buy it. And a lot of them work or partner with other suppliers in order for them to work together, and that way they know that they have the competitive advantage because they signed an agreement to work together. For example, Kinko and FedEx had cooperation to work together to reach the end consumer because they satisfied the needs of the consumer of delivery of packages, projects, and so forth, as well as the photocopying, the use of the computers, and whatever else Kinko is offering. So what motivates a business to buy a product? So it's a little bit similar to consumer, which will have to do with personal goals, but usually it has to do with the organizational goals. So the organization has objectives and has goals, and they also have a current state and a desired end state. So there are usually three types of tasks that will motivate an organization to buy. A new task buying, a straight rebuy, or a modified rebuy. So a new task buying will be the highest involved decision. So that will be when an organization needs to buy something they've never bought before. Let's take a university, for example. A university in a few years ago needed to buy computers for their students, maybe laptops. They never bought laptops before. So how do they decide if they're buying Macintosh or they're buying a PC? On the other hand, a straight rebuy would be that after they already made the decision, and today most universities obviously do have laptops and desktops and computer labs for their students, they just need to rebuy new computers for the same brand, usually. Or they will modify. So maybe they bought 20,000 units, and now they're going to buy 30, or they're going to buy 10. So those usually are the three types of decision that we will see. And each one will require a different approach because it will depend on how new the decision is to the organization, and also how risky it is to the organization and how involved the organization is in the purchase process. So there's a few things then that will affect or influence how the decision-making process will happen in a business as compared to when it involves the end consumer. So one thing would be the number of people involved in the business decision. So if it's a trivial routine buy, usually there will be one person. However, if it's a new decision or a risky decision, there probably will be more than a few people who will need to approve the decision. So we have what we call a buying center. And in the buying center, we have different roles. Now, those roles sometimes will also pop up in relation to the end consumer. However, here we do discuss them within the B2B. So obviously, the users will be those that will use the product. So if we go back to the computer example with the students and the university, the users will be the students, obviously. However, nobody asks the students what they want. The influencers will be those that will decide on what will be the specifications. So for example, what will be the size of the screen, the memory, maybe the price, maybe the weight, and whether it's going to be maybe a desktop or a laptop. The deciders will be those that actually decide on the purchase. So maybe in a university, it will be the provost. So she will get or he will get all the information, and they will make the final decision, though, which computer to buy. And then we have the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are the ones that actually control how much information gets to the deciders, because we can bombard them with information that might not be relevant because they're very busy, usually. And then finally, we have the buyers who actually purchase the process, the order. So as you can see, there are many roles involved in making a decision in an organization, which usually makes it a much longer purchase. However, usually the quantity is much higher and the profit is much higher. So a lot of organizations are willing to wait and see how the decision is made, and they're very patient because they know that the reward at the end is very high. So what kind of buying patterns we have in business to business? So business to business obviously will buy directly from the producer, because that's what makes it a B2B. They buy from the manufacturer to the organization that will later on will sell it to the end consumer. As we talked before, the relationships is very important. Because these are such long-term decisions, it's very important for the suppliers who waited to try to have a long-term relationship with the organization, so it will be rewarded and they will be loyal to them in the future. Now, some products, on the other hand, are not bought very frequently, while others do. So that really will depend on the type of the business. And negotiations can go on for months or even for years, as I mentioned, because there's a lot of people that are involved and there's a lot of money, and hence it's a very high involvement decision. So sometimes we have what we call a reciprocity involved, meaning that one business will buy some products from one business and then that business will buy some products from you. So that can also be what we call a give and take. And sometimes businesses will also make the decision based on the post-service. So for example, let's say you're a hospital and you buy MRIs or you buy CTs from GE. What kind of service will GE give to you after as compared to another medical company? So for organizations, the after-sale service is extremely important, which it's also important for end consumer, but sometimes not as much as a big organization, which sometimes it might just shut down the organization if the plane is not working or the MRI is not working. So customers, when it comes to B2B, actually are very much dependent on the suppliers and also on the guarantee that they will be able to continually get the products, but as well as keep the service alive and well. Now, another topic that's interesting to look at when we think of B2B is how you can segment the market. So obviously, you can use some of the same bases that we used when we segmented the B2C. Now, a lot of segmentation that's done in the business market will be based either on the type of customer or what we call industry classification. So for example, when PCs are sold, let's say by Dell, to a university, that can be a segmentation that's based on academia. So the industry will be academia versus maybe a corporation, because academia might have different needs for their computers as compared to a corporation. We can also segment by the size of the customer. So sometimes we have very large businesses, and sometimes we have very small businesses. So some companies, let's say even hospitals, again with the GE example. So some hospitals are very large and they're in big cities and will buy a few MRIs or a few CTs a year as compared to small town hospitals that maybe will buy it once every few years. So then the GE will segment the market based on the volume of the purchase, which then will affect what kind of marketing strategy they will offer this client. And another type of segmentation you want to consider when it comes to B2B is also the buying situation the customer is in. And in general, it's more pragmatic basis for segmentation, meaning it's less psychographic, it's less emotional, it's not about personality, but it's more about the usage and the benefits and the reward or the value that the organization gets at the end.